to start, I want to kind of set a bit of a frame and to trigger some people. In order to set the frame, I want to kind of talk in the realm of media or content in the form of things like the films that we've talked about, DC Comic, Marvel. Let's just take that as our starting point. But I want to set a frame for that. And in order to do that, I'm going to kind of poke a little bit on Jonathan Pageau and his parasitic storytelling video. And what I'm going to kind of claim here is that he's a Marxist, that Pageau is a Marxist. And it's tongue in cheek here a little bit, but I'll try
keep going. This is great. I love it.
I'll try to explain what I mean here, and then that'll set the kind of context I'm trying to get at. Because in that video, he describes this flipped over, this inverted thing that's happening in these films. He describes it as propaganda. And what that means is that we'll view the media landscape, let's say the product of the media, as the way, how is that functioning? Well, it's functioning as a projection of an agency in the background, an agency that has an agenda. And that agency is putting together this reframing of these stories and presenting it to us. And the image there is that media product has a power, and it has a power on us as, in a sense, passive spectators or consumers of that product. And the structure there then is one in which the direction of influence, the direction of power is from the media to us, changing us, influencing us, producing or effectuating the agenda of the agent. Now, who the agent is, I mean, we could say whatever, it's a embodiment of an ideology, to use the Christian term that you like to use. It's a principality in power. It's a community. It's an element of our culture that has a zeitgeist, however you want to say that. But the agent then has the production, and the production comes to us as consumers. And then, of course, Jonathan then turns around and says, well, the image there is a Marxist one, because the agent has the means of production. The agent is in control of the means of production of the content and uses that to influence or dominate or create hegemony or oppress or change our minds, influence the way we think about the world. And of course, Jonathan even takes on a revolutionary posture at the end of the video by saying we need to acquire the means of production. In other words, he says we need to make better stories. In other words, we need to infiltrate the citadel, take a hold of the means of production, and create our own stories. So this is a little bit tongue in cheek, but really that's what he is saying.
Yeah. That's fair.
Now, I think that's fine, because I actually agree with Jonathan's analysis of what's going on, but that's the way that's structured. So I want to say something that I think is probably going to seem obvious, and that is you can flip this story over. And in fact, we do flip the story over a lot of the time. And that is, we think that the products of media are really not that, but rather the manifestations of how we see the world. They're the outgrowth, the reflection of our zeitgeist. And that's the way I want to look at things. Now, I don't think things are either of those ways, really. I mean, it's going to end up being more complicated, and we're going to have a long discussion about how this stuff influences and feedback loops and whatever.
Absolutely.
But when we look back in history, I think most of the time, this is probably not really true, but I'll say it anyway. Most of the time, we're thinking that second way. We're thinking about some era in the past. We're seeing the products of that era, and we're saying, this tells us how these people thought. This tells us what they thought about the world. And that's that second way, not the first way.
Get this thing going.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah. Well, how have you been?
I mean, good. Things are real good. Family's good. I have been through a bit of a tragedy over the last couple of years. A good friend of mine passed away from cancer, so that's been a bit of a struggle.
Sorry.
But been through it now and on the other side of it. So
good.
So that's hard, but
yeah.
But I mean, it had me, as I was heading towards this conversation, had me thinking about a little bit how odd my participation in your corner of the internet is a little bit, because basically because of my age. There's you, me, there's who else in our age group, and
there's actually quite a few viewers and listeners who are in their
mature.
50s, 60s, 70s.
Anyway,
Vendonk is in his 70s. So yeah, the bulk is between 25 and 45, but there aren't that many under 25, which is interesting. It seems like this is something that people have to sort of settle in a little bit to start appreciating. But above that, there's still a considerable following. So, well, I think about the fact that you've seeded so many good ideas for me. You gave me the Wilfrid Sellers.
I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that.
Yeah. You also talked about, clued me into the rise of new atheism and Jordan Peterson in terms of the recession of modernity. I mean, you've given me a lot of good ideas. So when I got your email that you were, following along on the narrative stuff, boy, I was excited to hear. So,
well, we'll see. I've got some ideas there, and this is always fun for me. And I think you may remember I'm despite being a cardiologist, I was an English major when I was in college, and I've kind of been a devotee of what I think of the high Western civilization tradition, kind of literature and history kind of thing, as kind of my way into this kind of whole meaning realm. And so this is kind of in my wheelhouse, or at least what attracts me.
Yep.
And it's been a conversation that's been going on. Obviously, Peugeot likes to talk about this. You've got the critical drinker going. Certainly, Paul Antleitner's also. This is a kind of a thing for him. He has an affinity for this Marvel DC comic world, and using that as a launching pad to discuss ideas. So this is obviously something that's one domain of the conversation. And as you kind of spun up on it in the last few weeks, it got me thinking about some ideas that I've had before. So that was kind of why I poked you to talk.
Well, as a pastor, you very quickly realize that you do not have a monopoly on the religious inputs of the people in your church. In fact, in many respects, you're a minority voice. And if you're paying any attention to popular culture, music, movies, fewer people read good novels. That tends to stratify in terms of class often and education levels. But popular movies, not necessarily the art house films, popular movies deeply shape the American religious assumptions and the imaginary. And so to bring in Critical Drinker with his, with the persona that he brings and the cussing, I mean, that it's important. I know some people on the channel, they kind of step back from that, but much of the world that I deal with in terms of a church and the socioeconomic level that I deal with, they don't. I mean, that's where they're living. So
just before I launch into something here, there's something that I've always wanted to poke you on, but I don't know exactly where it would go. Probably not very far, but your relationship with the people around you in that community there, which you talk about regularly, and it's one of the elements of the way you present things that really is touching to me. The homeless people that are outside your door and how that interaction goes. It's something I think I mentioned briefly in one of our talks, and that's David Foster Wallace. This is his domain. He ended up in a halfway house, and in this journey with addiction, and it ended up leading to his writing his major work, which is called Infinite Jest. and the stories about how he lived in that halfway house, he kind of lived in there as both a member needing to be there, desperately needing to be there to save his life, but at the same time as a writer looking at all these people with the kind of compassionate view of a skilled writer. And in that book, Infinite Jest, there's just long tracks of discussions from first-person views of people living in that kind of difficulty, and spelled out in it's very sharp and difficult the way he writes, but it's also very subjective and therefore very compassionate about that situation. And when you start talking about these people you interact with, it just makes me remember and bring up the way in which he interacted with those people. So if there was ever a thought of investigating a little bit of that, I think you would enjoy it. He recreates that halfway house in the book, and it's kind of like a desperate refuge for all of these people, but they're there with kind of their whole soul. And he describes it as kind of a church-like community in a way. Anyway, that's just a little bit of an aside, but he is, how I think of David Foster Wallace is he's the guy who's intelligent, grew up in a academic background, smart and having literary skill as his highest value. And he is the guy who got stuck in the meaning crisis. He's the guy who lived out the kind of modern difficulty that we've been kind of talking about, and of course it ended badly for him. But nonetheless, he is I think one of the clear voices of our time in expressing that. So anyway,
no, I haven't tackled Infinite Jest. I've thought about it.
It's a major enterprise, and it's probably not to be recommended, really, actually, just because it's so big.
So a couple of weeks ago, I had about 4 or 5 homeless people living right out on one person. I most of the stuff I get from them, it got dubbed the Foundation of the Lord, which is the sidewalk that runs the length of the building here. And having known some of the people were new, some of the people I've known for years, one of them for at least a decade now. There's a level of community which is powerful yet fragile that I often catch glimpses of with them. They're able to sort of hold it together just sort of momentarily, and then their vices, their demons, just explodes it in violence, frustration, anger, cussing. But it's been a profound thing to be able to participate in. The encampment got broken up. One of the church members got a cop to come over here, and I'm sure the neighbors call it in fairly regularly, and because it's something that it's not easy to put into words or to represent, but it's clearly there. And
right,
I don't find, here's the great irony, the meaning crisis seems to be the it strikes the affluent, those who have options, whereas most of the folks on the street, I think in many ways living on the street is for some of them an antidote for the meaning crisis. It's a reliable, I don't recommend it, but it's a reliable treatment, because if you're living every day just on that edge, you don't have time for a meaning crisis. And for many of them, their lives are so one of the guys, Friday I brought him to the mental hospital again. He's now spending more time in than he is out. He's just turned 62. But I've watched this. It's also a terminal disease that I've watched people. I've watched it take many people. So yeah, it's.
Yeah, he would say Wallace would say something like, everybody around these people for the most part would rather give them a bit of money than to approach them, than to in any way come close to even looking them in the eye. And he really took that as because he ended up with them. He ended up there.
Yeah.
And so he took that as a kind of, in a way, a mission to not try to help them in the sense, but to be with them and to look them in the eye and try to know them in some sense,
I cherish a lot of the time that I've spent with them when that time has been sweet.
Yes.
Been lots of other times, but when the time is sweet, it is indeed sweet, because there is an honesty and a vulnerability and a reality to it that so often you simply don't get in other communions. Right. So and in fact, that sweetness, I think, has its own addiction and addictive nature to it, just like any sweetness in the world. So anyway.
All right. So yeah, that if you ever had the chance, he's talking about that. So anyway, so here's to start, I want to kind of set a bit of a frame and to trigger some people. In order to set the frame, I want to kind of talk in the realm of media or content in the form of things like the films that we've talked about, DC Comic, Marvel. Let's just take that as our starting point. But I want to set a frame for that. And in order to do that, I'm going to kind of poke a little bit on Jonathan Pajot and his parasitic storytelling video. And what I'm going to kind of claim here is that he's a Marxist, that Pajot is a Marxist. And it's tongue in cheek here a little bit, but I'll try to
keep going. This is great. I love it.
I'll try to explain what I mean here, and then that'll set the kind of context I'm trying to get at. Because in that video, he describes this flipped over, this inverted thing that's happening in these films. He describes it as propaganda. And what that means is that we'll view the media landscape, let's say the product of the media, as the way, how is that functioning? Well, it's functioning as a projection of an agency in the background, an agency that has an agenda. And that agency is putting together this reframing of these stories and presenting it to us. And the image there is that media product has a power, and it has a power on us as, in a sense, passive spectators or consumers of that product. And the structure there then is one in which the direction of influence, the direction of power is from the media to us, changing us, influencing us, producing or effectuating the agenda of the agent. Now, who the agent is, we could say whatever, it's a embodiment of an ideology, to use the Christian term that you like to use. It's a principality in power. It's a community. It's an element of our culture that has a zeitgeist, however you want to say that. But the agent then has the production, and the production comes to us as consumers. And then, of course, Jonathan then turns around and says, well, the image there is a Marxist one, because the agent has the means of production. The agent is in control of the means of production of the content and uses that to influence or dominate or create hegemony or oppress or change our minds, influence the way we think about the world. And of course, Jonathan even takes on a revolutionary posture at the end of the video by saying we need to acquire the means of production. In other words, he says, we need to make better stories. In other words, we need to infiltrate the Citadel, take a hold of the means of production and create our own stories. So this is a little bit tongue in cheek, but really that's what he is saying.
Yeah. That's fair.
Now, I think that's fine because I actually agree with Jonathan's analysis of what's going on, but that's the way that's structured. So I want to say something that I think is probably going to seem obvious, and that is you can flip this story over. And in fact, we do flip the story over a lot of the time. And that is we think that the products of media are really not that, but rather the manifestations of how we see the world. They're the outgrowth, the reflection of our zeitgeist. And that's the way I want to look at things. Now, I don't think things are either of those ways, really. I mean, it's going to end up being more complicated, and we're going to have a long discussion about how this stuff influences and feedback loops and whatever.
Absolutely.
But when we look back in history, I think most of the time, this is probably not really true, but I'll say it anyway. Most of the time, we're thinking that second way. We're thinking about some era in the past. We're seeing the products of that era, and we're saying, this tells us how these people thought. This tells us what they thought about the world. And that's that second way, not the first way. So that's just kind of the frame I wanted to set, that I'm thinking in those lines.
Yep.
And then I'm looking at this recent, let's say, domination of a certain kind of storytelling. And I'm seeing that something in the tradition that I am very familiar with is missing. It's not really there. And now I'm going to try to describe that thing that I think is missing. I played in my mind a couple of ways of trying to introduce this, and I think perhaps the simplest way is the Western. I studied Westerns for a while, about 10 or 15 years ago, and High Noon is kind of a classically structured Western. It's a 50s Western by a guy named Howard Hawks, and it's a very simple story. There's a sheriff. He is getting married to the pure girl from the East who arrives in town. She's a school teacher. He's going to get married to her, and he's going to give up his sheriff job because he's cleaned up the town and everything's hunky-dory, and he's going to ride off into the sunset with his new bride. And right at the beginning of the movie, the guy he put in jail 7 years ago or so has been unjustly let out of jail and is coming to town. He's going to recreate the bad world that the sheriff had cleaned up. And in the midst of it, he's going to kill the sheriff. His goal is revenge against the sheriff. And the story plays out, in somewhat complicated ways that aren't important to the point I'm trying to make. But of course, the wedding is off. He's now the sheriff again, and no one wants to help him. But the story builds to the point where there's the showdown. Of course, it's at high noon, and there's complications between him and the woman along the way. But in the end, right near the end of the movie, mano a mano in the street, sheriff kills the villain and rides up the school teacher, his bride. He throws down the sheriff's star, and they ride out of town. And that's the end of the movie. Now, that's the thing. The end of that is the thing that I think is missing and has kind of fallen off the map of storytelling recently. And I want to give that thing a little bit more flesh. It's what I want to call a generative arena. It's a circumstance in which the acting out of that world is building the future. It's possibility, and it's a kind of a stable place looking out into an open future. And of course, it's symbolized by a man and a woman and the potential for them to have children. And so that image would change the U-shaped journey of the hero, because it would put the end to be not really an end or the circle that Campbell has, but rather a destination. There would be a real destination there, maybe a plateau that is reached. And that's the goal. That's the telos of that story, of that narrative.
Right.
Now, if you go back to, I'm going to keep kind of babbling here. You jump in anytime
No,
you
keep
want.
going. You're very much so. I've only started this arc on what I've been doing, and you're very much hitting a lot of the points that I'm ruminating on for the next video, and in fact have half a video made. So keep going. We're tracking very well here.
All right. So the way this is structured, as an English professor would teach you as a sophomore English student, is he would refer back to the Elizabethan drama, and he would say that structure is the structure of a comedy. And he would say, there's lots of ways you can do the comedy thing, comedy tragedy thing, but one of the simplistic ways that it is done is comedies end in marriage, tragedies end in death. But I want to kind of expand that, because obviously High Noon is not a comedy in this kind of loose sense that we use it, or the common parlance sense that we use. It's not a light story. It's not funny. It's not, so that's not what we mean, or that's not what is meant, if you will, by that. But it's framed that way in the Elizabethan drama, because most of the time that's what's happening in Shakespeare. But the flip side, the opposite of that, is the tragedy. And the tragedy, of course, ends in death. But my take on this is that the tragedy has the same telos. It's just that the telos is frustrated. It's not, skipping up there, but it's frustrated. So if you take Hamlet, just to take an example, Hamlet starts off, it could be that comedy, because he's the prince, he's going to be the king, he's got Ophelia there to marry, she's a perfectly legitimate bride and mother and queen, and all's well. But that's not the way it ends up. Bad things happen, fate, murder, etc. Ophelia's dead, Hamlet's dad's dead, Hamlet's mom's dead, Hamlet's dead, everybody's dead. And in fact, the house of Hamlet is dead, because the play ends with Norway coming in and basically occupying Denmark, and there is no future. So death there. So now you can see the marriage and death are then symbols of, generativity and death and the end, no future. So, just to kind of emphasize how deep this goes, I think the best way to view the Iliad and the Odyssey is that it follows the same structure. So the Iliad is a tragedy. It starts with Paris and Helen getting together, star-crossed lovers, never going to work out, not going to turn into anything. The Greeks get together, go off to Troy, sack Troy, Troy's destroyed. The Greeks are falling apart at this point. They try to go home. There's totally scattered to four winds. Helen and Paris are separated, are not going to be a future. And the thing ends in disillusion, dispersion, and no future.
Right.
Now, of course, the arc continues, but it's a separate narrative. The Iliad is a separate narrative from the Odyssey, but the arc continues with the Odyssey. Odysseus has the goal of going home. He's going home to his wife. His son is seeking him out, holding the house together.
Yep.
He follows through on this. He goes through the hero's journey, and what's the end of the narrative? The end of the narrative is father, mother, and child.
Yep.
So this is a deep and continuous narrative. You can follow it from the Elizabethan to Jane Austen to Charles Dickens to the Western, as I've already mentioned. And so that's the narrative that's this telos that I was talking about in my comment in the email, is that telos, the telos of generativity, the telos of a future and a possibility, has been kind of a central stream in narrative, throughout the Western tradition. And it feels to me like that's that's something you can notice in these DC comic and Marvel movies, is that isn't there. It is not even a possibility in those narratives. And I can kind of go there if you want and kind of flesh that out, because I think there's a new narrative structure that's been placed on this. And I don't know, you want to throw in a few comments there, or you want me to keep running?
No, I think you should keep running, because I think you're right. And so what I did a little half video. I don't know if I'll redo it or where it'll go, but there's an interesting movement from, I agree 100% that these stories are in fact formative, but they are also expressive. And I think you're exactly right that when we look at them back in history, sometimes historians will pay attention to their formative influence, but we mostly look at them as expressive of the culture, of the zeitgeist, of sort of the values that are being expressed by that culture. And I think so I was looking at this. So if you look at, let's say, the structure of Star Wars, the structure of the first Matrix movie, very similar, but there's also transition in those. And actually a third thing I was thinking of pulling in recently was the Cobra Kai streaming, which is quite interesting in that part of what appears in a lot of these stories is that, okay, the happy ending, and then what? And
Exactly.
We don't seem to know what to do next.
That's a perfect segue into where I think I can start this transition. And I'm sure someone who's smart at this would say, no, this started long before, or something like that. But I'm going to start with James Bond.
Okay.
Because you look at a standard James Bond flick, and it's got almost the exact structure, right?
Yep.
There's James Bond. He's an MI6. He's there flirting with what's her name, and he's a smart guy. He's a great fighter. He's all that. And the crisis. We've got a villain, and he charges out to fight the villain. Bad things happen, obstacles. Alongside is this Bond girl. Oh, there she is, the Bond girl. She's there. She's with him. He's not gonna make it. He's trapped. The fates are against him. Whatever. Overcome the obstacles, destroy the villain, and there's he and the Bond girl in the love nest at the end of the film. And he's so involved in this, relationship that he doesn't even take the congratulations from MI6, as they call, or whatever. It's a classic ending, right? But James Bond is not a father, and the Bond girl is not a mother. That's not part of who they are. And I don't even, someone might say, well, maybe they'll go off again. But no, it's the structure of the narrative, the structure of the character is that they are not that person, in fact. And so there is no generativity there. And what there is eternal recurrence. The only thing that can happen, and obviously did happen on a repeated basis, is that Bond shakes himself off after his tryst, and he goes back to MI6, and he flirts with the girl behind the desk, and a new villain pops up, and off we go again. And this is a kind of a flat world. The world has nothing really in it except a Bond character at a given age. This is an ageless character, or he has no youth and he has no old age, although the guy who's playing him gets older as it goes on, but the character himself is frozen. This is a static, right, and essentially sterile world. And that, you can play that same story on Star Wars, not Star Wars, but Star Trek. Yep. Every time they open, there's the same character standing there in the same places in the bridge, and they're not getting married, they're not having kids, they're not doing anything but the next round. And I think in the end, these Marvel, the superhero stories are really stuck in that dynamic, and they even make it more the case by having the hero be even labeled or marked in their identity as not a possible participant in a generative future. And the classic version of that is probably the first one, and that is Superman. Superman starts, I mean, it's just intentional. You're in Iowa, or was it Kansas? I don't know. You've got mom and dad, the sweetest, nicest people you can imagine, a sterile couple who have this child that they love. Oh, this is great, but it's kind of the last child, because he's not going to be his father. He can't take that role. And we see it play out in the narrative that he can't play that role. And there's Lois Lane, and all they can do is look at each other, because they are not, and that then plays out, emphasized in each of the versions of the mutants / aliens / whatever the various iterations of the hero is. They are identity abstracted. Their identity abstracts them from the human condition in a certain sense. And there's things we could say about that, but so that's the kind of core idea. I go kind of give more and more examples, and a few of them I'd like to mention, but that I think the name for this, I think, let me make sure it doesn't escape me here, is what's the word for not wanting to have kids?
That's not an incel. It's
well, some of these guys are incels, but
yeah.
The technical term for saying you don't want to have kids because of global warming or whatever.
I didn't know there was a technical thing.
Oh, it's someone will put it in the comments. I'll think of it in a minute.
Okay.
I think that's pervasive in these stories, because there really isn't any option. There's no way out of that once you start where you're starting. And we could talk about the political nature of that. No one wants to grant the standard, male-female couple the highest point on the hierarchy, which is what you have to do here. I mean,
right.
Because if you want a future, that's got to be, on the top of the hierarchy.
Yep.
So anyway, that's this core of the idea, and then I'll let you muse a little bit about that.
No, I think that's right. And anybody who's wandered through my 3+ hours on same-sex marriage that I did a while ago, that's sort of where I come to, in that there is something deep here about, I think in our culture, right? I think we are in fact expressing a despair about our capacity, and that then gets reflected in these soft reboots. So I think you're right, it's the eternal recurrence, but there is a recurrence with the father, mother, child growing up, establishing a new home. There is a cycle, obviously, in that. And then within that cycle, you can play with all kinds of things, because the son is like the father, but is not the father. The daughter is like the mother, but is not the mother. And so that tends to be a very generative, that's fertile ground for story making, because there's always more to explore. And what we've been seeing are aging actors. And this is where sort of the Cobra Kai on Netflix gets interesting, because the main character of Cobra Kai is, of course, Johnny, who was beat by the Karate Kid back in the 80s. And
so this is what did Critical Drinker call this, redux, or
well, it's soft reboot.
Soft reboot.
But this isn't really a soft reboot, because the point is that so for In High Noon, for the sheriff, it's a comedy. Obviously, for the villain, it's a tragedy. Another issue that we're clearly dealing with culturally at many, many different levels that I think the films are trying to deal with it. You see, it's that way that it's very easy to to sort of look at the contemporary films and despair. But I think that falls into the trap of the films. I think it's a little more interesting to look at the films and say, okay, where's our stuckness coming from? And it's easy to say, oh, our stuckness is coming from the abandonment of the gender binary. Oh, okay. There's some truth to that. But the films are themselves trying to deal with things that in some ways had been answered, but the answers are rejected, partly because the answers are not fully fleshed out. We've got other films that are looking, let's say, The Good Place, which had 4 seasons on NBC. And there's Reboot on Amazon, where people are trying to play with afterlife. And most of them become, don't wind up with happiness, or as you said, a new heavens and a new earth, the unshackling of sin and the story beyond, but sort of a frustration and a boxed inness. And then there are also the Children of Groundhog Day, which again is eternal recurrence, but they tried to be a spiral because it's character development, and in a sense, the cycle ends when the character reaches a level of development and is then able to transcend and escape. And you can see religious predecessors for those kinds of storytelling as well. So I do think that even though there's a lot of frustration and anger in the dissatisfaction, and I think Critical Drinker is right that there's a degree of sloth and laziness with the soft reboot, but what is exposed in that is also the sterility of the culture and the decadence of the culture. And
that's my point, I think,
Yeah.
is that the genre is played out.
Yes.
You've played it out, and you can't do that iteration and keep people's attention forever. The problem is I'm not sure where else to go. I mean, you can see, there's exceptions to this thesis that I have, and I would put Avatar as an example of that. Again, it's not necessarily the ideology I'm pointing to here, but the ending. That there is the ending, which is the classic, the classic prince marries the princess and becomes the king in the end. And another one's going to be, and I think this is one of the things that I'm interested in people not criticizing Dune for this, but Dune is an old story. Dune is not a new story.
Right.
It's got an aristocracy kind of setup in it that's very reminiscent of, of kind of English aristocracy or Prussian aristocracy or something. And it is going to end in this very way with the prince marrying the princess and going off into the. So I'm not sure I would. I think having that at the center of the dramas that happen, it does reflect a culture that has that priority, even if the stories are varied. And the lack of it is telling us something about ourselves.
Yes.
And I see the Joker, you remember the Joker, right?
Yep.
I think the Joker is a kind of an example of a counterexample. It's a tragedy. That's a pure old-fashioned tragedy. He has a possible love interest in there, although it's completely frustrated, and she doesn't really even recognize him as who he thinks she does. But that's gestured at, and it's failed, and then the world ends because of the situation, but because there's no future. Another example of the same. You were talking to somebody about documentaries.
Yes.
One of my favorite documentaries is Grizzly Man. Grizzly Man was done by Werner Herzog. And I think you might like that if you could stomach watching it all the way through, because he's playing with, through that narrative, something separate from what I was talking about, but playing with two images of nature, two projections, human projections of nature. the main character, who's a guy named Treadwell, who's this guy who goes up and lives with grizzly bears. And this is a documentary that's basically using his life production of film, because he's a filmmaker who goes and lives with grizzlies, takes all this gorgeous film of them. And so and he narrates it himself. Treadwell narrates the video himself. So there's all this video of him himself telling you what he thinks and how he lives and all this stuff. And then these gorgeous pictures of grizzlies in Alaska that are, breathtaking. And while he's doing that, he's giving you a kind of very sophomoric, but I think very common view of nature as this idealized, romanticized view of what nature is. And he's there telling you that while these grizzly bears are, basically wandering right around him. And then Herzog has the counterpoint view of nature, which is that it's red in tooth and claw. And then of course we know how the story ends. And he doesn't die just by himself. He dies with his girlfriend,
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of a tragedy in that classic sense that I'm not sure what message it comes up with, but it's Herzog at his best. If you like Herzog, it's Herzog at his best.
I suspect we're probably going to see a flourishing of documentary because we do seem to be in a corner in terms of storytelling, we're definitely at a
turning point, you mean?
Well, whether it's a turning point, but we're at a
trap.
We're struggling. We're struggling. And I mean us as a civilization, we're struggling in terms of storytelling. And documentary, there was just a little bit of a conversation that I had with Justin Wells, but documentary at least has a canvas. So if you talk to Karen Wong, who's got the Meaning Code channel, I mean, she got into this whole thing because when she was doing art, she started doing art she'd start with a canvas, and then she would, in a sense, find the anomaly on the canvas and the materials that she had, and she would allow that to begin to shape the narrative. So in a sense, what Karen's art is sort of like documentary, in that you've got all of this material out there, and okay, so how do we pull the story out of it? And there is, in fact, more of a participation, because you had better not violate or disrespect the data of the story. You had better let that help shape it. But part of the documentary process is obviously the accentuation, the attention, the bringing. I don't know if you've looked at.
I haven't seen. Does she have that on her channel, the documentaries that she's made, or
she doesn't make documentaries? No.
Oh,
that's what she does with her visual art.
Oh, with her visual art, I see.
And she got interested in Jordan Peterson when she was reading Maps of Meaning, when she was paying attention to anomaly. And anomaly is a very interesting thing, because it is sort of the pattern resistant aspect of the world. And so you get into that, Peterson likes to talk about, especially in his Roger Scruton thing. I mean, truth is that thing that resists us in many ways. And so documentary has the capacity to basically force the storytellers out of their rhythms. It sort of has a shamanistic capacity to force them out of their rhythms, and hopefully to see a little bit deeper, see a little bit truer. So, I mean, there are a lot of layers to this storytelling. I don't want to use the word crisis, because the word is overused to some degree, but I think that's part of what we see happening in the culture. And that is, I agree with you, that is telling of the culture. And there are many other tells of that crisis, of a loss of conviction, a loss of, what did Ali Hersan, or
I know who you're referring to.
Yeah. When she was talking to Jordan Peterson, the one thing I got from that, I mean, there's a lot of culture war complaining, and part of what gets dull about all of this culture war stuff that we're in the midst of is so much of it's just complaint. It's like, all right, complaint is noted. Do you have anything else for me? Do you have anything productive? And, she talked about the loss of confidence in Western Europe.
In Western Europe, yeah.
And that certainly, so I think in the Babylon Bee conversation with Elon Musk, you saw a loss of confidence of evangelicals. That
I think that's right. Yeah, and I think that is reflected in this idea I have, but I think you're absolutely right. That's the background that we have. The other way of framing this is that it's a consequence of the individualism of our culture and the self-actualization as the priority. And I think you can see that in the narratives of the superhero stuff, because each superhero is manifesting their own, whatever it happens to be, their spider sting or their, and that's the highest priority, is to somehow self-actualize that.
Yep.
And when you do that, there's really no way to prioritize anything else. It could be, and this would be the best that we could do. You could say something like, well, yeah, having a family is one pretty good option. That's the best you can do. That's the best you can do. You can't say that's the priority here. That's the highest good. And that's then, it kind of feels to some degree like you're lost if that's the fact. If it's just one amongst many options to create, and I would want to go maybe beyond simply the nuclear family. I mean, it's more a symbol of generativity, a symbol of hope in the future or possibility. It doesn't necessarily have to take that form, I would guess, but.
I think you're very much right on. So self-actualization has sort of become the greatest good we can imagine. I think that's a function partly of the rise of the secret sacred self, because self-actualization into this individualistic self has become for many, well, this is the greatest goal. So you just look at, even especially in the Jordan Peterson sphere here, look at someone like, let's say, Chris Williamson. Even a lot of the wisdom conversations in the meaning crisis area is all about personal development, self-actualization, but you then are going to dead end at the individual. And you really have to see that an individual is too shallow a pond. And that, in fact,
Totally.
That we, I love the translation of Ecclesiastes when, it's, chapter 3, time for this, time for that, time for this, time for that. He has placed eternity in the hearts of men. And that then is our longing. So yeah, self-actualization, that's a wonderful thing, but it's insufficient. And I
totally
think in terms of storytelling, I remember Tim Keller's observation of the movie, The Lord of the Rings. Tim Keller, a big student of Tolkien, basically said he read Tolkien reads Tolkien about as much as he read the Bible. And he said, one of the issues of the movie is that Aragorn is in the movie conflicted. Should he become the king? Should he take up the sword? Now that change from Tolkien that Peter Jackson does, that's us. That's not Tolkien. And Tolkien has a point here, which is that the Lord of the Rings is not the story of Aragorn. Aragorn has a place in that story, but he can't be the center of the story. And part of what happens with self-actualization as the center is it starves the rest of the story, and it also starves the rest of the characters. Now suddenly it's sort of a falling into solipsism, and we see this interpersonally and relationally with people.
I was going to use Lord of the Rings, and I think the parallel example is Saving Private Ryan as a different kind of variation on this theme, because, and this is something I'm getting a little bit of stories of old. He did a little deal on this, but the way I see Lord of the Rings, and and I'm not as up on the book, so people can criticize me that I'm talking about the movie now, but the hero structure there is that the telos of that narrative is Sam.
Yes.
And the Shire.
Yes.
And Frodo is the self. He's performing the self-sacrificial act to create the circumstance in which Sam can go home, and that's the end of the film, right? Is that Sam's there with his wife and kids, and they've got the Shire's doing fine and happy.
Yep.
That structure, in I like to look at it in Saving Private Ryan, which is exactly the same story, right? Because it ends with Private Ryan over the grave, and the Tom Hanks character's grave is there, and he's saying, did I do what I needed to, or did I do enough? And he's got his family there.
Yeah.
That was the point.
Yes. Yes.
But the way it kind of structures this is it kind of allows for, if you will, self-actualization, as long as the self-actualization is being Tom Hanks. By that, I mean, you can have the ecstatic, individual effort, heroic, experiential, kind of seeking out thrills and seeking out experience. That's not necessarily wrong intrinsically, as long as it's got the right telos.
Right.
And in the end, that telos is the generative future. Right.
And it's not, and see, this was part of, when I was talking about the hero's journey, what I've seen is that in many ways that, Peterson and many others are framing the hero's journey as a story of self-actualization.
Exactly.
And it's,
yep.
And certainly there is self-actualization that happens, but that, I think, is part of the blindness of individualism. And what you actually have in a fuller, better, bigger story that I think we find finally more satisfying is that there's self-realization, self-actualization going on in Sam, in Frodo, but now Frodo and Bilbo's self-actualization is finally in some ways, sacrificial. Now they go off into the gray havens, with the elves.
Right.
But it's, there's a longing and a mourning. And even though in some ways in that universe, the elves are going back to they're returning home. In some ways, the elves in Middle Earth were colonials.
Yeah, it seems to me like Tolkien's kind of not quite wanting to frame exactly what that is supposed to be. I mean, but it clearly is this it's not like it would be right to end the movie with Frodo living in the house next door to Sam with his
wife and children.
Wife and child. That would not be the end. That was not the correct end.
Right. But I think, and I think also theologically there are. So the biblical story ends obviously for Christians, and I had an interesting conversation with Yosef, and I think this is probably an interesting place for Christians and Jews to speak together, because in many ways the Christian corpus, the Christian story comes and says, this is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And of course, rabbinic Judaism goes in a different direction. I'm not sure how they actually, to what degree they have wrapped up their story or have the picture. But of course, the end of the Christian story is it's something of a return. There's a new heaven and a new earth, but there's also development. It's a city, not a garden. It's, and then all of those things. Yet, part of what I see in the culture as well is this, on one hand, there's a skepticism, there's an unbelief about the end of the story. Sometimes that's articulated straightforwardly by, eternity would be boring. A lot of those critiques, you see it expressed artistically in The Good Place. And in fact, the end of The Good Place is, spoiler, folks, if you haven't seen the end of The Good Place is another death.
Mm.
And it's
I
death.
I didn't watch it all the way to the end.
Yeah.
But
that's the end.
Yeah.
The end is, and then you get the line that, it's endings that give meaning to the journey.
Right.
But that goes exactly to your point here, which is
that's tragedy.
That's tragedy.
Right.
It ends in death.
It ends in, and death is the symbol of the absence of the stop,
right.
the end.
Right. So, and I think these are telling of a culture that has lost confidence. And we see this, I hope you can remember that word because I want to learn it. A generation that says we should not, the moral case against childbearing, we should not bring children into this world because there's, environmental catastrophe. And I look at them and say, we kind of had nuclear holocaust hanging over our heads when we had you.
Right. And it's you're right. This confidence is the thing. It's a kind of, it's the way you frame, I've kind of, every time I hear kind of comments about, what is the ground, and for example, Christians complaining to atheists that they can't have a morality because they don't have a ground. I feel like I'm going off into a little bit of a different direction, but I feel like there is a ground, and that's our incarnate being. Our ground is that you are 20 years old, and you're not going to be 20 years old forever. And you're going to be 40, and you're going to be 45, and then you're not going to have any kids. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
and you have no idea what that means.
And to have this stagnant image that I was describing in James Bond, to have this that there isn't an age there, it just isn't the case that the Bond, as he's being shuffled out the door for the next actor who's going to be the new Bond, that he's the same guy that he was before. Right. That isn't what we're living.
Right.
And yet that's the story. The story is you can actualize anything at any point, and that means you're the same. And that means it doesn't mean anything that you are in this phase of an incarnate existence.
Right.
Which turns out to be, at least one of the principal functions of that moment is to come together and make a future.
Yes.
And I've made that point a few times.
I don't know,
but it's based on our incarnate situation. It's based on that.
You might. So the rest is history. Tom Holland's podcast has an episode on James Bond.
Yeah, I've heard it. Yeah.
Okay.
I love that. Tom Holland is, my guy, just like yours. So,
but now it's interesting with Bond because, what's been happening with Bond is Bond has been Bond through Sean Connery, through Roger Moore and Daniel Craig. And I haven't watched a Bond movie in years. I watched a Bond movie when I was at the age that Bond movies were
already old.
Yes, already old. That's right. When I was young, they were already old. But now, so then you have the whole intersectionality Me Too crisis reaching James Bond. And so you can see in some funny ways, well, where's this going to go? Can you just have a Jane Bond instead? And it's like, well, that doesn't work. And well, why doesn't it work? And We're not
Here's
sure
a-
to say why it doesn't work.
Here's a turn for you, because this would be going to kind of biblical interpretation stuff, but there is a problem though that is real in that situation,
Right.
the gender stuff and the and that is that the circumstance in which the context in which we lived generations ago, we're different.
Yep.
I'll
Yep.
tell you, I went to medical school in 1987, and 51% of my class were women. And that's 25, 30 years ago. The circumstance in which the physical attributes of my maleness mean something in my activity in the world, that's not entirely, but it is not there anymore.
Right. Right.
And we are not going to say, I don't think either one of us or very many people would say that it's wrong for, women to play roles that they're perfectly fit to play in the world.
Yep.
And that is a change on the ground. That's a different thing. And so some element of what's being talked about in these narratives is reflecting a reality that we don't even regret in a certain sense.
Yep.
And that makes the problem harder in a way, because we have to do something new. We have to deal with that. And what I meant by that being a kind of touching on a kind of hermeneutical notion in the biblical text is that, we're constantly looking back at that context of the narrative, and we're saying something like, God condescends, he speaks in the language of the era. That's how you're supposed to interpret what this narrative or that narrative in the text means. So that must grant some validity in a certain sense to that context, and also give a little bit of resistance to pulling that out and putting it on our context, and also say something like, shouldn't God speak to us in our context?
Yes.
And that context is different. It's not the same.
Yes. Yes.
And those are hard things to grapple with, I think.
I think so. If one element of storytelling has been sort of the assertive, formative, propagandistic element, and the second, the expressive, I think the third is the processing, because what we're doing with storytelling is that, well, let's try Jane Bond and see how it works. Right. And so we're trying Jane Bond, and well, that didn't really, well, maybe if we have her be like this or have her be like that, or under what conditions does Jane Bond work, under what, and we're really sort of feeling our way through these issues with our storytelling. Mm-hmm. And so we're watching ourselves watch the stories, and we're watching marketplaces, and of course it's a fully live conversation, and I think it should be. No, it's and by this is, perhaps I'm making sort of a free story argument analogous to a free speech argument. I mean, go ahead and tell the stories. Right? Go ahead and try and see what you can find and see how it goes, and let this group over here say, oh, that's because you're all patriarchs and you don't like this movie because you're a man or you're a bigot. Okay, you can say that. Okay, I don't have a problem.
And let's have some smart people like Jonathan Pajot step into the fray and try to do his damnedest to do something different. Exactly. I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that.
And so I think on one hand, there's a sense of decadence, of a culture that has lost its confidence and sort of found itself into a corner. Another perspective is that, well, we haven't necessarily stopped trying. And even if the soft reboot is sort of a bad idea, well, at least we figured out that's a bad idea, and we can, can go on. And as is almost always the case, it's things arise that are delightfully surprising. Star Wars in 77, yeah, it's a space Western. I get that. And yeah, George Lucas grew up in Modesto and saw redwoods. And all that is true and all that's fine. But it obviously did something. And we can look at that doing something and say, oh, aha, well, we can learn something. And maybe part of what we'll learn is that I think Peterson often oversells the individual.
Right.
Because the individual only has, the job of the individual, the job of David is to save Israel. That the telos of David is not David, it's right. Israel.
Yeah, and I think this this marriage symbol that I, you can formulate that in that way. The thought I had was to, again, I'm going to channel Jonathan Pageau again because I like him so much. He talks about the microphone. You remember that microphone deal he does about the, he also talks about chairs. The thing that he's noticing things coming together in unity or into something. And he's saying that we see that first, right? And it's a mystery how that holds together. And that's the way things lay out, coming together. And he uses the label for that love. He says love is the driving force of things coming together. But this is an old kind of conversation in the long history of philosophy, the one and the many. And the way I've thought that through before and seen it talked about is that the first thing you do is you grasp in his nativity talk, he was talking about a microphone. That's why I'm using that as an example. And the first thing you do is you grasp the microphone as what it is, as a microphone, as a whole. You don't notice or have any awareness of its parts. But the next step, which Jonathan also talks about in a different way, is that you notice that it's complex. That is to say, you notice as a whole, it's made up of all these parts.
Right. And
you then realize that taking those apart will ultimately undo the microphone as a microphone.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that Jonathan picks this out as an example of the prior, the kind of medieval or pre-modern way of viewing things, because I think in the pre-modern view, they would have used not a material object. They would have used an organism. And so my example would be like a rose bush. If you take a rose bush, you see the bud, and you see it as you grasp it as a whole, but it's really not that. I mean, it came from the plant and it's going to the bloom and it's going to wilt, but the plant is going to come. So you only grasp it in part, but you grasp it as the whole that it is, mm-hmm. which is beyond your vision of it. Mm-hmm. But it has to be part of that, or else it dies. Mm-hmm. That is to say, if you cut the rose off, and it's kind of amazing if you watch it, if you don't put it in water, within a few hours, it's going to wilt and come apart. It's going to decay and become nothing. And that's the way organisms are. That's the opposition between the whole and the dispersion of the parts, what Jonathan would call chaos. If you then imagine that in the human context, because we are, we can't see the world other than through our own eyes. In other words, we can't see the world other than as human beings. We have to frame our view of things from our own context. So we can't think about roses or microphones. We think about human beings. And if you think of the whole human organism, that's not going to make it, because a single human organism is going to die and be the end. Mm-hmm. A family that has a child and that child doesn't marry and doesn't produce, it becomes the end.
Yep. Yep.
So the only way for that to be envisioned is as community. That is to say, as coming together with the irreducible unit. Let's say the irreducible unit is not the individual. The irreducible unit is the community.
Yep.
Because otherwise there is not a future. Otherwise there is no possibility. There's no hope. There's no future.
Okay.
And if you look at that, then that as a broad sense of a community, then you look at, well, what's going to be the ideal element, ideal unreducible element of that community? Well, it's going to be the sanctioned couple. It's going to be the couple who is given the role of being the vehicle through which the future happens.
Yep.
And so there's different versions of the way we are together, but in some sense, there's an idealized version of our irreducible generative element.
Yeah.
And so
there's
another version of the same story there.
Yes. And I think, again, in Christianity, it's interesting that, of course, Christianity is founded in many respects by two bachelors, Christ and Paul. Yet Christianity sort of finds, well, what are you going to do with that then? How can Christ be the telos? Well, Christ is wed to the community.
Right.
And his bride is a community. And the fertile union of Christ with the community is in fact new heaven and new earth. Right.
And that's what I mean by the image of the couple, irreducible couple, is really a symbol. It's a symbol of that possibility of the future. It's not only, let's say, it's not only the actual, married couple. Right. It goes beyond that. It goes beyond. It shows this. It shows the emptiness of pure or deeply committed individualism. It can't really be the final answer there. So
and yet in the community, again, quite nicely, the Christian image then also shows that in the community one need not only participate in that, let's say, as a productive male-female pair, because
there's widows, that makes it more complex, and we obviously have to include that complexity in the thinking about it. You're absolutely right.
But they all then get to participate in this, and again, that's one of the real weaknesses of one of the real problems in storytelling now, when self-actualization becomes the telos.
Right.
All those other role players are unfertile. They're it's a solipsism. They're absorbed into the self-actualization of the hero, and again, it's finally less fruitful
goes nowhere
than a fuller story. So
well, there's the idea there.
Oh, that's super. That's super. I thought this was really good. Yeah. Hey, you're always, when you emailed me, I thought, oh, good, he's still around.
Well, who knows? It's just me spinning it all out. I enjoy it. I like listening to almost everything you do. You got the variety, which I like, because it's not just you talking, but the personal stuff is the individuals who come and share themselves is very valuable. And so I'm still engaged in all that.
Good. Because one of the things of just sending things out, I'm sitting in this room all by myself. I have this PC and this monitor and this camera and this light and this mic. And
you notice I don't have a light because the sun is going down.
Yeah.
I'm drifting off into the dark here,
but it's you never quite know what's on the other end of it, which is kind of exciting, but also you don't know what you don't know. So
yeah, that's right. And well,
thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming back in, and
I appreciate the community and the relationship, which I value, even though I'm only I'm not able to kind of do the comments or the Discord or anything, but I still like being part of it, and I'm very grateful.
Well, it is true, and I very much recognize it, that there are some who can be on Discord and some are in the comments. And one of the nice things about this is that there are many levels of participation, and they're all different. They're it's hard to.
You know, speaking of participation, I'd gotten the plans set up and the time blocked off to go to Thunder Bay. So that's the kind of thing that I can do because I can project forward and schedule something. So I would be, I'd be still interested in that kind of stuff if we ever get past the
yeah
where we're at.
And I know actually next week I'm going to have. So Catherine is one of the organizers of the Thunder Bay event. She's on the Discord server, and I'm going to do a video with her and her husband, who I've also gotten to know quite well over the last few years. He's a psychologist who also has a theological degree, and he knows a lot about trauma. So we're going to talk about trauma, deconversion. So there are. But I think many understand that the telos, or at least, something that's very big about this is in fact having in person.
I told you I sat with Jonathan Peugeot and Benjamin Boyce at that conference in Seattle. That was definitely a good experience, and I'd love to be able to do more of that.
Yeah. So I think I certainly hope that these things will come, and I hope that COVID will not last forever, at least in all the expressions of it. And we will once again be free to move about the country, and at least the two countries, because Canada is way more restrictive than here.
Yeah, I think that people should look at that. I mean, we have our contention, but our contention leads to a kind of sloppy something else.
Yes.
And other places aren't exactly that way.
No. So I pray for the release of my Canadian brothers, and Australia seems open fairly. I just talked to an Australian friend last night. So anyway, all right. It's great to see you, Jim.
Yep. Good to see you.
All right. Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.